In part 1, we demonstrated that the Bible places the wilderness of Shur to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba. When archaeologists place Shur over against Egypt, they are imposing their interpretation of what they think the Bible is saying, rather than listening to what the Bible is actually saying. We have demonstrated that it is the whole of the region between Havilah and Shur which is over against or facing Egypt, and that people are wrongly interpreting the text when they claim that Shur itself was over against Egypt. By placing this wilderness over against Egypt, they have completely corrupted our understanding of what the Bible is actually telling us. We then proceeded to show that the wilderness of Etam is the place otherwise known as wilderness of Edom, the name Etam being synonymous with the name Edom. We then demonstrated the true meaning of the name Watir, as in Wadi Watir, and showed how this Wadi ties in with the Exodus. One thing which I didn't mention in part 1 is that the Philadelphus tablet talks of Pi-HaHiroth, which is called Pi-Karechet in that tablet, as being good pasture land. Those who know the area around Nuweiba beach will tell you that there is no pasture land anywhere near that place. As I have stated in part 1, and this will become more evident when we get to the final 3 parts of this video, the Jews who returned from Babylon and Persia during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah did not have a clue where many of these places were located. The Philadelphus tablet dates to the Greek Hellenistic period, which is centuries after the Exodus. Whoever wrote the inscription on that tablet clearly did not know where Pi-HaHiroth was actually located. This might also explain why Rashi thought that Pi-HaHiroth was the Egyptian city of Pitom. Rashi was clearly correct when he described the Hiroth as being 2 upright rocks with a valley between. But you will not find upright rocks with a valley between either in a store city or at the mouth of a canal. He has obviously combined 2 different traditions, one of which is based on false information. We should not, however, let these sorts of problems detract us from what the biblical text actually tells us. As demonstrated in part 1 of this series of videos, we must let the Bible speak for itself. Putting these reservations aside, we shall now first of all look at a couple of objections which are being raised about the Exodus itself, and then look at the actual crossing point and tackle the objections being raised against this Nuweiba location for the Red Sea crossing. There is a lot of controversy, for example, over the number of Israelites who comprised the Exodus party. It should be stressed that the Bible only gives a very brief account of the Exodus. It only gives the information which we need to know. When the Israelites left Egypt, they would have had wagons as well as cattle and flocks of sheep and other livestock. In the first month in the 2nd year after leaving Egypt, the princes of each of the houses of Israel donated some of their wagons to the Levites. And they brought their offering before the Lord, 6 covered wagons and 12 oxen, a wagon for every 2 of the princes, and for each one an ox, and they presented them before the tabernacle. On the assumption that these 6 wagons being donated represented a tithe, that is 1/10, then we are talking of a total of around 60 wagons, which would be a large wagon train. These wagons must have been fairly sizable as well, seeing as how they would have had to transport the tabernacle as well as all of its furnishings, the curtain wall around the court, as well as the altar and laver for purification. The tabernacle was huge. So where did they get these wagons from if not from Egypt? Going back in time, Joseph, when speaking to his brothers, said, "Now thou art commanded, this do ye, Take you wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. And again we are told, And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, and their little ones, and their wives, in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. Although the Bible does not explicitly state that wagons were used in the Exodus, it is clear that some of the women and children and elderly, as well as their baggage, would have been conveyed by wagons. The controversy continues, with archaeologists claiming that the Hebrew word for 1,000 does not actually mean 1,000, but rather the Hebrew word elef, which is translated as 1,000, more correctly means a single captain. In Exodus 12 verse 37, for instance, we read, And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 on foot that were men beside children. It is being claimed that the 600,000 on foot should more correctly read 600 captains on foot, which, as I shall proceed to demonstrate, is shown by the Bible itself to be false. Note that an aluf is someone who is in charge of 1,000 people. Hence 600 alufs would control 600,000 people. So even if you argue that it is referring to 600 captains rather than 600,000, there would still be 600,000 people. We are told that Moses chose able men out of all Israel, and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. It would not make sense to interpret this passage as meaning that the rulers of thousands were captains over a small number of people, when you also had rulers who were in control of other smaller numbers of people. The Bible then is self-explanatory. We have to be very careful that we do not impose our own interpretations on the Bible to make it say what we expect it should be telling us. We have demonstrated this to good effect in part 1 of this series of videos, when we showed that the wilderness of Shur was to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, not over against Egypt as most people are assuming. Josephus informs us that Pharaoh gave chase with a substantial army. For the number of Egyptians that pursued after them was 600 chariots with 50,000 horsemen and 200,000 footmen, all armed. The 600 chariots is confirmed by Exodus 14 verse 7. Pharaoh would not have sent an army of this size just to retrieve a small handful of people. Another piece of evidence which is often overlooked is the amount of money paid by the people when a census is taken. As it is recorded, "This they shall give every one that passeth among them that are numbered, half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is 20 gerahs, and half a shekel shall be the offering of the Lord. Every one that passeth among them that are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering unto the Lord. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than half a shekel, when they give an offering unto the Lord, to make an atonement for your souls." When you examine how much was paid, and compare this to the numbers involved, we can see that the amount is commensurate with the 650,000 men which the Bible says left Egypt. And the silver of them that were numbered of the congregation was 100 talents, and 1,760 shekels after the shekel of the sanctuary. A beker for every man, that is half a shekel, after the shekel of the sanctuary, for every one that went to be numbered, from 20 years old and upward, for 600,000 and 3,550 men. A talent is understood to have been worth 3,000 shekels, though in Babylonia a talent was worth 3,600 shekels, which is slightly more. But for the purpose of this exercise we shall work to the lower value. So 100 talents works out at 300,000 shekels. Add on to that 1,775 shekels, and we arrive at 301,775 shekels. Each person gave half a shekel, so when we doubled this figure, we can calculate that there were precisely 603,550 men aged 20 and above, this excluding women and children. When we add in the women and the children, we are looking at a minimum population of around 1 million people. Even if we use a conservative estimate of 2,000 shekels to a talent, we are still looking at 404,550 men, which is still way over what scholars are claiming to have been the maximum size of the Israelite party. So go do the maths. We have a similar situation when we look at the numbers when broken down into the various tribes as recorded in the second chapter of the book of Numbers. When you add up all the subtotals, here highlighted in bold text, the numbers only add up if you interpret the word Eleph as 1,000. They don't add up if you interpret Eleph as captain. So once again, I would suggest that you do the maths. There is no way that you can interpret Eleph as meaning captain. In part 1, we demonstrated that the Wadi Watir is the Biblical Pi-HaHiroth. This means that the beach at Nuweiba is where the Israelite party became entangled in the land. This then brings us onto the two columns marking out the crossing point. The picture on the left shows the one which, until recently, was standing on Nuweiba beach, having been found lying in the water by Ron Wyatt. This column has recently disappeared, and no one knows where it has gone. The column on the Saudi Arabian side was removed by the Saudis shortly after Ron Wyatt visited the spot. The Arabs are going around destroying evidence. They don't want anything which supports a Jewish presence in this region. For example, this was a petroglyph showing a menorah. It is located not far from the mountain known as Jebel al-Lawz. Note how it has since been defaced. Someone has completely obliterated it. This is nothing short of vandalism, but this sort of practice is going on all the while.
When I look at that, what I see is a Roman column. It's a typical Roman column. It's nothing to do with the period of Solomon at all.
David Roll is claiming that this column on the Nuweiba side of the crossing is Roman, but he is unable to explain how it or its Saudi Arabian counterpart got there. We are talking about one solitary column on either side of this crossing point. There are no buildings anywhere even remotely nearby from which these columns could possibly have been sourced. The nearest Roman structures were in Tel Chizban in Jordan, which were around 409 kilometres, that is 254 miles north of Nuweiba, or in Cairo in Egypt, around 471 kilometres or 290 miles away. The two columns which used to stand on either side of this crossing point between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia therefore had to have been put there for a specific purpose. If you do a Google search, you will see that the Roman style of architecture is merely a variation of the Doric style. The Dorians are classed as Greeks. So who then were the Dorians? To answer that question, we need to take a huge detour. This detour is necessary to help us understand why this classification of Roman is tenuous. When you realise that this Doric style of architecture is actually Phoenician Israelite, it completely changes our understanding of history and shows how these distinctions between various styles of architecture being applied by archaeologists are based on pseudo-scientific classifications. Let's start by looking at what Josephus has recorded. Josephus tells us that King Solomon's palace was of Corinthian design. This house was a large and curious building, and was supported by many pillars, which Solomon built to contain a multitude for hearing causes, and taking cognizance of suits. It was sufficiently capacious to contain a great body of men who would come together to have their causes determined. It was 100 cubits long and 50 broad and 30 high, supported by quadrangular pillars which were all of cedar. But its roof was according to the Corinthian order, with folding doors, and their adjoining pillars of equal magnitude, each fluted with 3 cavities, which building was at once firm and very ornamental. A number of capitals which archaeologists are calling Proto-Aeolic have been found in Jerusalem, Samaria and Megiddo. It can be shown that the Aeolians were descended from Joel, son of Reuben, though it would take too long to explain it here in this video. This will be the subject of a separate video in which we will look at the formation of the Greek states, which archaeologists are dating far too early. In fact, if you have watched part 2 of my video, The Phoenicians Who Founded Spain, you will know that these Aeolians eventually settled in the Auvergne region of France, these being the people variously called Aroerni and Ueli by the Greeks. Archaeologists love making fine distinctions between various types of metal products, pottery and architecture. This Proto-Aeolic style of architecture is actually nothing other than a variation on the Doric style of architecture. Josephus also likened the feet of the table on which were placed the showbread in the temple to those which the Dorians put to their bedsteads. This so-called Doric style is actually Israelite, and seems to be associated specifically with the 2 tribes of Joseph, that is, Ephraim and Manasseh. In a separate video, I shall demonstrate that the Dorians came from Dor in northern Israel. The city of Dor belonged to the tribe of Joseph, namely Ephraim and Manasseh. It should be noted that, according to 1 Chronicles 9 verse 3, during the time of Kings David and Solomon, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh were dwelling in Jerusalem. It is therefore highly feasible that they were responsible for much of the construction work, as well as the manufacture of many of the items made for the temple. The reason why archaeologists excavating at Dor in northern Israel are finding Greek influences dating back to the 10th century BCE is because those Greek influences are actually of Israelite origin. The revisions I am making to the Greek history show that the Greek states which we are familiar with today were founded by Israelites who arrived in Greece after they had been deported from the land of Israel by the Assyrians and Chaldeans. The cities of Corinth, Athens and all the other famous places in Greece did not even exist prior to this date. I shan't go into this in too much detail here, as it deserves a separate video in its own right. But according to a number of classical writers, Corinth was originally called Ephyra. The city is said to have been built by someone called Sisyphus. If the name Sisyphus had been written Josephus, people might have made the connection that Ephyra is a variant spelling of the name Ephraim, and that Sisyphus is a variant spelling of the name Joseph. Note that Sisyphus is called a son of Aeolus, this being a tribe of people known as Aeolians. As I have already stated, the Aeolians were descended from Joel, son of Reuben. This association of the tribe of Joseph with the tribe of Joelites is an allegorical one. Again, I shall not go into that here, as it will take too long to explain. If you are interested, You will find an in-depth explanation of how allegory works in part 1 of my video, The Phoenicians Who Founded Spain, including examples of how these early Greek writers were turning tribes and cities into fictitious people. Herodotus called these Ephyreans who settled in Greece Gephyreans. Strabo tells us that they were also known as Tanagreans. We shall come back to this name Tanagrean in a moment. Let's first concentrate on the name Gephyra. Ptolemy places the city of Gephyra in northern Israel. Admittedly, the Bible mentions a couple of places in Israel with this name Gephyra, though you will find that this name has been transliterated in most English translations as Ophrah. There was a city of Gephyra or Ophrah mentioned in Joshua 18 verse 23 and in 1 Samuel 13 verse 17, which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. Another Gephyra or Ophrah belonged to the tribe of Manasseh and is mentioned in a number of places in the book of Judges. The city of Gephyra mentioned by Ptolemy, however, is located far too far north to be identifiable with either of these two places. In the absence of any other candidate, this city of Gephyra mentioned by Ptolemy is most likely to be the city of Ephraim mentioned in the New Testament Gospel of John. This name Ephraim is usually written with an aleph as the initial letter, but in 2 Chronicles 13 verse 19 it is written with an ayin as the first letter. The ayin is a guttural and is often transliterated as a G. The city of Gaza, for example, is written with this letter ayin, a name which is 3 times transliterated in the King James Version as Azza. The Bible therefore shows that the name Ephraim can also be written Gephraim. Hence the names Ephyreans and Gephyreans, which have been used interchangeably by these Greek writers, are referring to the very same people, a people we know from the Bible as the tribe of Ephraim. Ephyra was not only the original name of Corinth, but was also the name of a couple of other Greek cities. According to a number of classical writers, Ephyra was a daughter of the river Oceanus. This again is allegory. Hesiod, who is one of the earliest Greek writers, informs us that the river Oceanus had 3,000 daughters who are dispersed far and wide, as well as an innumerable number of sons. Again, without going into too much detail here, the river Oceanus is the river we know as the river Euphrates. These sons and daughters of the river Oceanus are tribes who came from the Euphrates region after they had been displaced by the Assyrians. Archaeologists would have us believe that the Dorians arrived in Greece around 1200 BCE. I can assure you that these Greek settlers started arriving in Greece shortly after the northern 10 tribes had been taken into captivity. The Greek writers inform us that the original inhabitants had been forced out of Greece during the flood of Deucalion, a flood which I can reveal occurred when Sennacherib was king of Assyria and Hezekiah was king of Judah. Again, it would take too long to go into that here in this video. We shall look at this in more detail in a future video when we come to look at the formation of the Greek states. It will also be discussed in a future video on geology, as this flood of Deucalion had wide-reaching implications which affected the fossil and geological records. These Ephyreans later abandoned the city of Corinth. When they did, they separated into 2 factions. One faction settled further north in Greece in the regions known anciently as Epirus, Elis and Acarnania, the other in Umbria in northern Italy. Again, this is not the place to cover the migration of these Israelite tribes here. The intention is merely to draw your attention to who they were. The Hebrew letter Ayin can be transliterated into other languages a number of different ways. It can be a G as in Gaza and Gomorrah, or it can be transliterated as an O as in Omri, king of Israel, and as an A as in Amalek, and so on. The Hebrew letter Shin can likewise become a T when transliterated into another language. Hence Josephus and Ptolemy called the region of Bashan in northern Israel Batanaean. As already stated, the Gephyreans were also known as Tanagreans. There was anciently a land of Tanager in Greece. Applying what I have said above to the name Shinar, we get Tanager, from which the word Tanagrean is derived. These Tanagreans came from the region around the Black Sea, this being referred to in the Targum Yonathan as the Pontic Shinar. Yes, these Greek settlers were from the very regions where the Assyrians placed the deported Israelites. The first inhabitants of Greece to arrive after the flood of Deucalion were a mixture of Israelites and Edomites. The claim by archaeologists that the city of Dor in northern Israel had Greek influences dating back to the 10th century BCE now means that these influences could not possibly have come from Greece. These Greek influences were actually Israelite. Hopefully you can now appreciate what a pig's ear archaeologists have made of the archaeological record. I am not trying to be disrespectful. It is just a sad fact that they have inadvertently made such a mess of things. Just to clarify what I said about the Israelite tribes who settled in Greece having come from the river Euphrates, in the second book of Kings we are told that in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Chala and in Chabor by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. When people read this passage, they automatically envisage the Israelites being taken to the land of the Medes, which existed at a much later date, this being to the north of the Zagros Mountains. Is it any surprise then that no one can find evidence of any Israelite presence in this region? Herodotus informs us, "For the boundary of the Median and Lydian empires was the river Halys, which flows from the Armenian mountains, first through Cilicia, and afterwards between the Mattiani on the right and the Phrygians on the other hand. Then, passing these and still flowing north, it separates the Cappadocian Syrians on the right from the Paphlagonians on the left." This is the river Halys. This is Phrygia. This then is the land of the Medes as it was in the time of the Assyrian invasion, and which the Assyrian records designate as the land of the Medes. When we look at this region, we find evidence of Israelite occupation right up until late in the 1st century of the Common Era, if not later. The land of Colchis between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, for example, was named after Calchol, son of Zerach of the tribe of Judah, who was called Calchios by Josephus. The land of Iberia likewise was named after the Hebrews who at one time dwelt there. Neither of these names existed prior to the time of the conquest of the northern 10 tribes. The first use of this name Iberia, for example, dates no earlier than the 2nd century BCE, when, according to the Greek historian Strabo, Artaxias I, king of Armenia, attacked the Iberians. These Iberians were Hebrews. They were Israelites. The Tahachati, who are recorded as dwelling here, were a family named after Tachat, son of Ephraim. The region of Becheria was likewise named after Becher, son of Ephraim. The Chaniocheti were named after Chanok, son of Reuben. These are the people other writers have called Chaniochi. The Macrones, who Herodotus says were in his day located in the region to the south of the Black Sea, just west of the Becherians, were descended from Machias, son of Manasseh. Under the name Mechrani, the Assyrian king Adad-nirari II even places these Macrones in his day in the land which the Bible calls the land of Gilead. This was before they were deported by the Assyrians and resettled in this area around the Black Sea. Herodotus also tells us that the Macrones, as well as the Phoenicians, the Syrians of Philistia and the Colchians, all practiced circumcision, this specifically being an Israelite practice based on the promise given by God to Abraham. The claim by Herodotus that they learned circumcision from the Egyptians, however, can be shown to be false. When we look in the right place, we find evidence to show where the Israelites went. And we are not talking about a small insignificant number of people. I shan't go into this in any depth here, as this is a separate topic in its own right. If you want to know more, you might want to download my paper entitled The Forgotten Tribe of Naphtali and the Phoenicians, which you can download in PDF format either from my website ancienthistoryreconsidered.com or from academia.edu. Just do a Google search and you will find it. The important thing to bear in mind is that these are the regions that many of the Greek settlers came from. This is the Pontic Shinar mentioned in the work known as Targum Jonathan. This is where the Tanagreans who settled in Greece came from. This is where the sons and daughters of the river Oceanus came from. As already mentioned, it is not my intention to go into this in any great detail here, as this requires a separate video in its own right. But very briefly, the Boeotians who built the city of Ascara in Greece named themselves after Baasha, king of Israel, who belonged to the tribe of Issachar. The name Boeotia being a variant spelling of Baasha, whilst Ascara is a variant spelling of Issachar. Messenia in Greece was named after the tribe of Manasseh, or as it appears in the authorized version, Manasseh. Note the metathesis. Athens was founded by a family named after Ethan son of Zerach of the tribe of Judah, who was called Athanas by Josephus. The Athenian law, which forms the basis of the law kept by most of the Western nations, is based on the law of Moses as kept by the northern kingdom of Israel. The Dorians, who migrated to Anatolia from Greece and are said to have been related to the Athenians, were called sons of Electra. The name Electra means bright and shining, and has exactly the same meaning as the Hebrew name Zerach. These Dorians were descended from Dara son of Zerach of the tribe of Judah, who is called Dara in the first book of Chronicles and Dardanus by Josephus. These Dardanians were called Danaan by Homer. When we come to look at the Irish history, we shall see that this is where the Tuatha de Danann who settled in Ireland came from, and that Dara, who is said by the Irish to have been the mythical king of the Tuatha de Danann, who was renowned for his wisdom, is Darda son of Zerach. We shall show that all three of these names, Darda, Dar and Dardanus, are likewise used interchangeably in the Irish records. The Greek writers Hesiod and Apollodorus both tell us that Electra was a daughter of the river Oceanus, this being the river Euphrates. My research reveals that Rome was built by Israelites descended from the tribes of Manasseh and Reuben. But again, this is too big a subject to tackle here. Once again, this information is contained in my paper mentioned earlier, which is entitled The Forgotten Tribe of Naphtali and the Phoenicians. In short, what David Roll and others are calling Roman architecture is in fact Phoenician Israelite. Another thing I would point out is that when the Romans took control of Jerusalem, there was no place for them to build a fort. So they commandeered a building which had been constructed by John Hyrcanus for the hanging of the priestly garments, and they called that Fort Antonia. As Josephus records, "Now on the north side of the temple was built a citadel, whose walls were square and strong, and of extraordinary firmness. This citadel was built by the kings of the Asamonean race, who were also high priests before Herod, and they called it the tower in which were reposited the vestments of the high priest, which the high priest only put on at the time when he was to offer sacrifice. But for the tower itself, when Herod the king of the Jews had fortified it more firmly than before, in order to secure and guard the temple, he gratified Antonius, who was his friend and the Roman ruler, and then gave it the name of the Tower of Antonia." There was likewise no place for the Romans to build anything at Byblos. The suggestion by archaeologists that there are no Phoenician buildings still standing at Byblos makes no sense. This assumes that the Romans will have destroyed their Phoenician buildings in order to construct their own buildings. There are actually numerous Phoenician remains at Byblos, but archaeologists are claiming that they are all Roman. Returning to the column which until recently stood on Nuweiba beach, this is similar to ones found at Baalbek in northern Israel, and which are again said to be Roman. This is despite the fact that the Romans supposedly built their main temple directly on top of an older temple, using the giant foundation stones as a platform for their temple, and left no remains whatsoever, whether in the form of rubble or other remains, of the previous temple. Amazingly, the base of the so-called Roman temple was built to the same length and width and orientation of the original foundations. How likely is this? A very timely document has appeared from Marco Vigato of Harvard University, who has done an excellent job of collating all the information we have on the Baalbek temples, and has also documented many of the archaeological enigmas surrounding the construction of these temples at Baalbek. I would stress, however, that Vigato, like all other researchers before him, is assuming that the temples were built by the Romans, an assumption I shall here be challenging. Vigato writes, "The tell itself was likely never more than a small fortified settlement, approximately 100 metres in diameter, smaller in fact than the area now occupied by the great court of the Temple of Jupiter. It is difficult to see how such a modest village, scarcely distinguishable from many others in the Bekaa Valley, could by itself account for the decision to erect the largest temple complex of the Roman world at this precise location. Note that there is no written evidence to support the idea that the Romans built the main temple. In fact, as Vigato records, a 6th century document known as the Oracle of Baalbek, part of an anonymous apocalyptic composition written in Greek, contains a further reference to the building of the temples of Baalbek under 3 kings, Antiochus, Tiberius and Gaius Caligula, saying that these kings built up, or perhaps rebuilt, the temples of Heliopolis and the altars of Lebanon. I would here challenge Vigato's interpretation of built up as meaning rebuilt. Why can we not accept that built up simply means built up, an expression which means added to? Having demonstrated that the Roman style of architecture is an extension of the Doric, and that the Dorians were Israelite, then this throws a completely different light on the matter. The Roman construction at this site would have been additions and extensions to the original structures, not a complete rebuild as everyone is assuming. There are 5 different sources quoted by Vigato which attribute the building of the temple at Baalbek to King Solomon. If that is the case, then this temple would have been built by Israelites. Just as there are in Jerusalem, there were subterranean passages underneath the Jupiter temple at Baalbek. Coincidence, perhaps? Bear in mind that the Proto-Aeolic columns found at Jerusalem, Samaria and Megiddo are likewise Phoenician Israelite. The Aeolians were descended from Joel, son of Reuben. This Proto-Aeolic style was called Corinthian by Josephus. In my video, The Phoenicians Who Founded Spain, I demonstrated that the Phoenicians who founded the first colonies in Spain were Israelites who arrived in Spain during the time of King Solomon, and that Spain was named after Ishpan and Heber of the tribe of Benjamin. Ishpan called Spain España, and Heber called it Iberia. Vigato even points out that the orientation of the Jupiter temple complex at Baalbek matches that of the Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem. Another coincidence, perhaps? Vigato also draws a comparison of the Baalbek temple with coins depicting the temple of Emesene Baal, and concludes that they are probably one and the same place. The Emesene Baal temple, however, predates the Roman occupation of Baalbek. That there was a temple standing at this site before the Romans arrived is indisputable, but evidence for its existence is proving elusive. There is not one scrap of evidence of any remains of a previous temple. Could this be because we are already looking at the original temple? If the Romans, as is claimed in the Oracle of Baalbek document, merely built up the temples, then these temples are more correctly Phoenician Israelite structures to which the Romans have simply added their own enhancements. Vigato puts it succinctly when he writes, "While local traditions, mythic associations and the very location and orientation of the Baalbek temple complex all point compellingly toward a pre-Roman origin of the site, more than a century of archaeological investigation has yet to produce conclusive material evidence to substantiate this hypothesis. Since the first German excavations of 1898 to 1905, and despite the abundance of alternative theories, no unequivocal proof has emerged that securely dates the origins of the sanctuary itself to a period earlier than the Roman era. There are, however, numerous columns which are classed as Corinthian in design. Note that not all of them were fluted. The small temple was surrounded on the outside by 50 columns, of which 14 fluted ones were erected in the pronaos, and the rest, which were not fluted, completed the circuit of the temple. Each column was composed of 5 enormous blocks of stone, including the base and the capitals. Just because one lot were fluted and the others were not, does not mean that they are from different eras. Both the fluted and non-fluted columns at Baalbek were of Corinthian design, and as explained earlier, the Corinthians were Israelites descended from the tribe of Ephraim. As Aloof records, the Temple of Jupiter was formerly enclosed by 54 unfluted columns in the Corinthian style, 10 columns in front and 17 on each side, of which only 6 remain standing, which are in the south peristyle. Bearing in mind that this Corinthian style of architecture is Phoenician Israelite, these Corinthian columns were most likely there before the Romans arrived. If you have watched my video, History Through the Ages, I pointed out how archaeologists love making fine distinctions between various styles of pottery, art or metallurgy, and assigning them to different eras. This, however, is evolutionist thinking, one which is corrupting our interpretation of the archaeological evidence. Bear in mind that rocks and buildings cannot be easily dated. A lot of archaeology relies on interpretations, and those interpretations are the results of the archaeologist's best guess. Even when there is an inscription carved in the walls, it does not follow that the inscription is to be dated to the same period as that in which the wall was built. It could have been added centuries later. The evidence at Baalbek is being interpreted as though everything has to be assigned to the Roman period of occupation. When you apply that bias, then you are going to be interpreting the evidence accordingly. As far as the Baalbek temples are concerned, I shall leave you with the following comment made by Friedrich Reget. The real mystery of Baalbek is the total absence of written records on its construction. Which emperor would not have wished to share the fame of its creation? Which architect would not have thought to inscribe his name proudly on one of the countless blocks of stone? It is as if Heliopolitan Jupiter alone takes all the credit. There was also a temple to Jupiter in the city of Tyre. As Josephus records, when Abibalus was dead, his son Hiram reigned. He raised the eastern parts of the city higher and made the city itself larger. He also joined the temple of Jupiter, which before stood by itself, to the city, by raising a bank in the middle between them, and he adorned it with donations of gold. Again, there is no record of a Roman temple being built in Tyre, and yet archaeologists have recently found remains of a temple which they claim is Roman. Seriously? Would it not be more logical to assume that this temple is actually Phoenician, and that it is remains of the Phoenician temple mentioned by Josephus? Note that they have not yet identified the deity that was worshipped in the temple, but its location on a podium in the most elevated area of the ancient island highlights this building's particular status, which is what one would expect of the Jupiter temple. Note once again that it is only Roman because archaeologists are classifying the style of architecture as Roman. It is much more likely, especially when we bear in mind the prominent elevated location of the temple, that these are remains of the Jupiter temple being referred to by Josephus. Massive foundation stones have also been found at the Parthenon in Athens in Greece, as well as at the Greek temple in Samos. The fluted columns, which are classed as Greek, are merely a variation on the Doric style. Just because they are fluted does not mean that they should be treated any differently to those at Baalbek, where there is a mixture of fluted and non-fluted columns. Having put forward the claim that many of the Greek settlers were of Israelite descent, these similarities in construction can now be easily explained. It should be stressed that similar giant stones have been found in Jerusalem. This art of cutting and of moving huge stones seems to be peculiar to Israel, more specifically to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh who were dwelling in Jerusalem during the time of King Solomon, some of whom later emerged as the people known as Dorians. In short, what archaeologists are classifying as Roman architecture is in fact Phoenician Israelite. This all might seem a little extreme, but we must bear in mind that the Romans were constructing buildings in the Doric and Corinthian styles. This makes any attempt at distinguishing between what is actually Roman and what is Phoenician, Greek or whatever that much more difficult. What I am demonstrating here is that archaeologists have been far too quick to classify structures such as these which we have just been discussing as Roman. The stonemasons who built the Roman structures were descended from the same fraternity who built King Solomon's temple, as well as many of the Greek and Phoenician structures. Bear in mind that the father of Hiram, king of Tyre, belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. The Hebrew reads Ben Isha Almanahu Mimate Naphtali, which translates literally as son of a widow woman was he of the tribe of Naphtali. The Septuagint also clearly states that Hiram belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. In part 1 of my video entitled The Phoenicians Who Founded Spain, we have shown that the Phoenicians who settled in Spain were of Israelite descent, and that Hiram, king of Tyre, belonged to the tribe of Yetzer, the third-born son of Naphtali. The second book of Chronicles even tells us that Hiram's mother belonged to the tribe of Dan, with the Babylonian Talmud using the words house of Dan. It should also be stressed that Tyre and Sidon were part of Asher's inheritance. In other words, these cities were under Israelite control. Because of the errors made by archaeologists in their interpretation of the archaeological evidence, they have pushed back the historical records to some far too early date and are calling these Israelites Canaanites. In so doing, the important part these Phoenicians have played in the formation of the European states has been overlooked. As I have demonstrated in my video, The Phoenicians Who Founded Spain, the Phoenicians introduced laws based on the law of Moses. Also, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Athenian law, which forms the basis of the legal system employed by most Western countries, is based on the law of Moses as it was being kept by the northern 10 tribes. All of this has been hidden from us because of this incorrect interpretation of the archaeological evidence. This is a picture of the Temple of Poseidon, also known as the Temple of Hera, at Paestum in southern Italy. This temple was built by Phoenicians. Does it look much different in style to other structures which archaeologists are claiming are Roman or Greek? This time the fluted columns are different in that they start off bulging out at the sides, but then narrow out at the top. This, however, is nothing more than a variation in a style rather than being a completely different style. Archaeologists are once again making fine distinctions in style and giving them different classifications at will, even when they are effectively a variation on the same style. If you haven't watched my video, History Through the Ages, which takes an in-depth look at the problems inherent in the various dating methods, you might want to do so after watching this video. Archaeologists are applying pseudo-scientific principles to the archaeological evidence and then claiming that they are following the science. In a separate video entitled Pratanike Nessos, I shall demonstrate that some of the descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh settled in the British Isles, predominantly in England, Scotland and Wales. This means that many of the settlers who settled in North America were also from these tribes. In my opinion, it is no coincidence that the Freemasons have a tradition that their fraternity were involved in the building of King Solomon's temple. Bear in mind also that the Lincoln Memorial and the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in the USA are also of this same Doric Corinthian style. Consider also the National Gallery in London, which was designed by architect William Wilkins, who had connections with the Freemasons. Notice that Wilkins utilised Greek revival motifs in the building, which historically resonated with the esoteric and architectural symbolism valued in Freemasonry. I am interpreting this as meaning that this style of architecture is favoured by Freemasons. Note also that Sir Christopher Wren, who constructed St. Paul's Cathedral in London, was also a Freemason. Again, the use of Corinthian columns is associated with Freemasonry. I would stress that I am not condoning or promoting the Freemasons, as I am averse to any secret society. We cannot, however, ignore the evidence. When you join all the dots, the association of these Masons with these so-called Greek and Roman structures is undeniable, and the corruption of the northern 10 tribes by adopting pagan practices is well documented in the Bible. So, returning to the Nuweiba crossing point, we have one solitary column on the one side of the crossing point, though this has recently been removed and no one seems to know where it went. There was also one solitary column on the Saudi Arabian shore on the other side of the crossing, though this was removed many years ago, which means that very few people have actually seen it. Whilst this column on the Nuweiba side is similar in style to others which have been classed as Roman, it does not mean that the Romans erected this column. According to a number of sources, not just Wikipedia as shown here, the supposed main difference between Doric and Roman columns is that the Romans added a base to their column and reduced its diameter in relation to its height. Bear in mind also that this supposed difference is an interpretation of the evidence being imposed on it by archaeologists. Note then that the pillar on Nuweiba beach therefore fits the description of a Doric column rather than a Roman one. So think about it. Why would the Romans have left only one solitary column on either side of this crossing point? As I have hopefully demonstrated, these columns are no different to Phoenician columns, so to argue that they are Roman purely on the basis of their style is simply wrong. There will be those who will argue that no one has seen the column on the Saudi Arabian side, and that we are totally reliant on what Ron Wyatt has told us. Actually, this is not totally true. Dr. Sung Hak Kim became the personal physician to the governor of Mecca. Whilst in Saudi Arabia, he visited the Jebel al-Lawz region and also visited the site where the column on the Saudi Arabian side once stood. This is his testimony.
So myself also, I have been to the Nuweiba. I checked the stone pillar, opposite side in Saudi Arabia side. This stone pillar was also in front of the Nuweiba. So I found on one day morning the Saudi boy was fishing on the seaside. So I met him, I asked about the stone pillar. He said, yeah, it was there, but where is now? He said he's not allowed to talk. And then I started to mention about the royal family and so and so. And he started to talk about dead stories. He said that they write on the stone pillar by Arabic letter, La illa illallah. It means Allah, God is only one. And they written there, and this stone pillar they put in the seawater. He said almost between 4 to 5 meters under the sea, the stone pillar is there.
Now, before anyone pulls me up on this, I am fully aware that the writing in the photograph of the Red Sea Coastal Survey pillar, which was shown in this video clip, does not say what Dr. Kim is claiming. Whether or not he is referring to some other inscription, I am unable to say. It is nonetheless curious as to why the Saudi Arabian government should have erected a pillar at this particular spot. For the benefit of those who are still highly skeptical, here is a video taken by Ron Wyatt from the Nuweiba shore, where you can just about make out the other column.
Every time that Ron and I would go to Nuweiba, he would want me to look across there with the telephoto lens and try to see if I could see the column over there.
Yeah. Okay, because this is right at that one wadi, that big one.
Okay.
Okay, then the other was probably fortress, and this is the column because it's all by itself.
Okay, I've never seen it from this distance.
All right, let me back off and see where this is. Okay, that's right, by that big wadi. Okay.
Admittedly, the quality of the video is not brilliant, but it is good enough to see that there was at that time a column on the opposite shore. It seems that there are people who are trying to debunk the evidence simply because of the association with Ron Wyatt. Those people are simply allowing their prejudice to cloud their thinking. Now, I don't know whether or not Ron Wyatt could read ancient Hebrew. It would presumably have been written in what is being called the Proto-Canaanite script. But what was written on it is immaterial. There were at one time 2 columns marking out the Red Sea crossing point, and that is what we should be focusing on. Let's now look at the crossing through the sea itself. In part 1, we demonstrated that the Gulf of Aqaba is called Yam Suf in a number of places in the Bible, and that this is the sea through which the Israelites passed on dry land. By imposing the meaning of Sea of Reeds on the name Yam Suf, it is misleading everyone into believing that Israel crossed through a shallow marshy lake. We demonstrated that there are other interpretations of Yam Suf being applied by archaeologists apart from Sea of Reeds. As archaeologist Donald Redford reveals.
But there are others who derive Suf from the word for destruction. Yam Suf, the sea of destruction.
Really?
Yeah, and there is another word, Suf, well, it's the same, from the same root. Meaning the end.
The end, yeah.
Final part of the sea.
We also showed that there were 2 references in the Bible suggesting that Suf was probably the name of a region at the northern extremity of the Gulf of Aqaba, in which case Yam Suf might simply mean the sea of this region called Suf. Either way, the Gulf of Aqaba is undeniably Yam Suf, and when the Bible states that the Lord took them through the depths of the sea, it means the depths of the sea. And with the blast of thy nostrils the waters were gathered together, the floods stood upright as an heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea. Note here that we are told that the waters were gathered together with the blast of his nostrils. This is the only place where this statement appears. Note also that the waters were congealed. In other words, they were turned to ice. They froze solid. No wind could possibly have accomplished this. The east wind is generally a hot wind, often referred to as Khamsin. A hot wind would not cause the sea to freeze or congeal. He rebuked the Red Sea, that is Yam Suf, also, and it was dried up, so he led them through the depths as through the wilderness. Are they not it which have dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that have made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over? Note that in every instance the emphasis is on the Lord causing the waters to part. The following passage is the one causing the most controversy. And the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all the night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Most scholars are interpreting this as meaning that the Lord used the wind to push back the waters. This is the only place in the whole of the Bible where it is suggesting that it was a strong east wind which pushed the waters back. But we have already read that the Lord caused the waters to gather together and become a heap by the breath of his nostrils. So why the discrepancy? Bear in mind what I said earlier in part 1 about how biblical Hebrew can be difficult to understand. Notice first of all, where it says made the sea dry land, the word yasem, which is here translated as made, is masculine. By contrast, the Hebrew word ruach, meaning wind, is feminine, which means that if it was the wind which dried out the seabed, then it would require that this Hebrew word be tasem. In other words, it was the Lord who made the sea dry land. Secondly, the words Baruch Kadim Azah can be translated as either by a strong east wind, which is how in this instance the English translators have translated these words, with a strong east wind, on a strong east wind, or even in a strong east wind. Take your pick. If it is to be translated as in a strong east wind, then it simply means that the Lord was operating in a strong east wind. This latter interpretation seems to be borne out by other biblical passages. The suggestion that the wind was responsible for pushing the water back is pure inference. Most people are interpreting this passage as though the wind was instrumental in pushing the waters back. But it can also be interpreted that the wind was a consequence of the waters being pushed back. When we compare this passage with other passages, the latter interpretation seems to be the one which is correct. It clearly states in a number of places that the Lord pushed the waters back. And now that we have demonstrated that the wilderness of Shur is located to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and have identified the Gulf of Aqaba as the crossing point, by no stretch of the imagination can a wind possibly have been solely responsible for pushing the waters back in the manner being described, especially as the east wind would be blowing the wrong way to push the water back. Bear in mind that Moses was describing what he saw and felt. When the waters were separated, it would have created a corridor through which the wind would have travelled. Being on the western shore of the crossing point, he would have been facing almost due east, which means that the wind would have felt like an east wind. This would also have meant that this east wind would have had to force the waters to heap up both towards the north and the south, which is impossible to explain by natural forces. I see this as providing further support for the alternative interpretation being proposed here, where the wind was a consequence rather than a cause of the parting of the waters. This then means that the Lord did not use the wind to push back the waters or to cause the seabed to dry out. He did this himself. Bear in mind what I said about the waters congealing, that is, they became frozen solid. If the seabed had also frozen over, then the crossing would have been treacherous, because the seafloor would have been like a skating rink. There is no scientific explanation for this. Those who try to relegate God to an ineffectual God who has to rely on natural causes to explain away the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, or at most on miraculous timings, do not believe in a God who created the heavens and the earth. It has not helped that people's minds have been conditioned by evolutionist thinking, where everything has to be explained by naturalistic causes. He, that is the Lord, cleaved the sea and caused them to pass through, and he, that is the Lord, made the waters to stand as a heap. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. The depths have covered them, they sank into the bottom as a stone. The emphasis is always on the Lord pushing back the waters, not the wind, as well as an emphasis on the great depth of the sea. There is no way that a wind alone can be responsible for parting the deep waters of the Gulf of Aqaba.
But for this purpose, I raised you up. Why? To show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. That's what God is doing in the Exodus. And a natural event would not have accomplished it. It needed a divine intrusion to overcome the greatest army on the planet.
When the water is removed, there is a path through the depths of the sea which would have been perfectly manageable. To the north and south of this path, the seafloor drops steeply to estimated depths of around 2 miles.
So what I've done here is laid out the slope that would have been encountered going down and up within this path in the sea. And this is to scale horizontally and vertically. And so going down, we're talking about a 10.5% slope, 6 degree average. And it's a little steeper going up, average 13% to 7.4 degrees. Again, this is to scale, and this is based on the best bathymetry data we have, which goes way back to 2000. To put this in perspective, a maximum grade on an interstate highway is 6 to 7 degrees.
So, as you can see, when the water is removed, the path through the sea would be perfectly suited for the crossing.
For coral is a living organism that will not begin to grow on a foundation of sand or silt. Instead, it must first attach itself to a solid object, where it will sometimes conform to the shape of its host.
So for instance, if it would grow on a wooden artifact, the wood would normally disappear in the seawaters after a time. But if you have corals growing on the wooden artifact, the coral could have the shape of the wooden artifact. And then the corals would consume the wooden material over periods of time, but still keep the shape of the wooden artifacts.
As the narrator states, coral will not grow on sand or silt. So the coral is spread out on various fragments of rock or other objects. And as stated, these formations here are completely different from those found in the northern and southern tips of the Gulf, and you can see that many of them are circular. The suggestion that they simply look like chariot wheels, but can't possibly be chariot wheels, is basically a denial of the evidence. In this next video clip, we hear from Keaton Halley, who has a master's degree in Christian apologetics, discussing the coral formations in the Gulf of Aqaba with Dawn Blount of Creation Ministries.
And so the scuba divers have been diving on both sides, at Nuweiba Beach and also from the Saudi Arabia side. Most of the photographs are simply photographs of coral. They don't find actually like parts of wooden chariots like wheels or the hubs or leather that the Egyptians also used to construct their chariots. But so we have a great idea of, how these chariots were constructed, lightweight, made of wood and leather. And one of the difficulties is that wood and leather are going to deteriorate if they're just exposed on the seafloor in this salty water. They're not going to last for thousands of years. But the claim is usually not that they're finding the wooden parts, but they say that these, corals have actually encrusted the chariot parts. And so even if they've deteriorated, all that's left is coral that's in the shape of chariot wheels and axles and so forth. And sure, when you go diving there, you can see from the photographs, some of them look superficially like chariot parts, but I would argue that's all it is.
It's just the coral.
It's just coral, not even necessarily encrusting anything, because we have a coral expert on our staff who has mentioned to me there's a certain genus of coral that grows in the Red Sea. It's called Acropora, and it grows naturally in these shapes. You can see stalks, and then it'll spread out into a plate-like disc above the stalk.
So easily could be confused.
Exactly. And, you look at the photographs that people are advocating, and it's a lot of imagination that goes into saying this is definitely a chariot wheel. It's in the eye of the beholder. There's no real reason to think that it's encrusting an Egyptian chariot. They do sometimes bring metal detectors and other scientific equipment with them, But, you think about it, there'd be a whole ton of modern garbage on the seafloor as well. And so how do you know if you do detect metal that it has anything to do with chariots?
But we wouldn't even expect to find metal if it's wood and leather.
Yeah.
So that's really not that helpful.
First of all, this is Acropora. It does not grow naturally into these chariot wheel shapes as Keaton Halley alleges. It cannot form an umbrella covering on top of another coral either, such as in the example we shall give in a moment. Coral does not form like this anywhere else in the world, but he knows that it cannot be a chariot wheel because he knows that coral grows like this here in this one place. The statement he makes about how the chariot wheels did not contain any metal parts is also complete and utter nonsense. If the axle joints were wooden, the wheels would quickly catch fire because of the build-up of friction as wood rubs against wood. This is a lame excuse for not accepting the obvious interpretation. Dr. Muller also found human and animal bones on the sea floor at this crossing point. Keaton Halley didn't think to mention that.
They're not allowed to take up a single coral from the sea at this location. It's illegal to do that. But the divers did find what they believe were animal and human skeletal remains.
When we found this, we speculated over that it's rather similar to a human femur.
I think if you compare those two, there are certain likeness, of course. So I think you have the caput here, going into the hip bone, and this you have for muscular attachment here.
Similar to this one.
To this one here. But if you follow what we call the diaphysis, like this, you can see that they are very much alike, and it's sort of a little bent.
Yeah.
And that's very, very special for the human femur. So I think it's not a bad likeness.
Take a good look at this formation, which is probably the best example we have. The coral here at the bottom is what is known as pillar coral. Pillar coral usually grows like this. Notice that it grows upwards. It does not fan out at the top as it is doing in this picture taken by Leonard Moller's team. Note also that there is a different type of coral growing here on top. The picture is not clear enough to be able to identify this particular coral. It looks like it might be Acropora. But if this is pillar coral at the base, then how likely is it that you will get a different coral growing on top of pillar coral? Now look how thin this central shaft is. Pillar coral simply does not grow like this, so I would strongly challenge the claim that this is a natural formation. This coral is clearly growing on something man-made. If it was all just coral, then the umbrella-like overhang which you see here would have simply collapsed under its own weight a long time ago. There has to be something under that coral which is holding it up like this. Look at this recreation again. Bear in mind that these formations are found nowhere else on this planet. We have shown how the Gulf of Aqaba, whenever it is referenced in the Bible, is always referred to as Yam Suf. We have demonstrated that the wilderness of Shur was to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, explaining important biblical passages which clearly show this to be the case. We have demonstrated that the wilderness of Etam is synonymous with the wilderness of Edom. We have demonstrated that the Wadi Watir is the Biblical Pi-HaHiroth, the word Watir being a metathesis of Hirat, a name which aptly describes the dire situation the Israelites were in when they were enclosed in the land. This means that this crossing point between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia is undeniably the place where the Israelites crossed through the depths of the sea. This being the case, there is no reason why these cannot be remains of chariot parts which have been covered with coral. In part 3, we will now demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt that Jabal Makla in northwest Saudi Arabia is the biblical Mount Sinai, and will provide written evidence that Jews were operating in this area right up until the latter part of the 1st century of the Common Era. So join me for part 3 of Journey Through the Wilderness.